Hey, Sports Capital Symposium, Dan Kaufman, Sport Techies Managing Director here. Up next, we have a tech talk from one of the brightest minds in the gaming space and particularly in the sports betting space, Chris Grove. He's partner at Eilers and Kretschik Gaming. His tech talk is titled Legal U.S. Sports Betting, How Policy Shapes the Opportunity for Sports Stakeholders. Chris, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Dan. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to focus in on how some of the policy components of how individual states authorize legal sports betting impacts the market opportunity from legal sports betting for sports stakeholders. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. The first thing I want to do before we get into anything more specific around policy is just talking at a high level about what the economic opportunity for sports stakeholders from sports betting actually is. There are two primary buckets to this opportunity. The first and most obvious are sportsbook marketing dollars. A couple of things to note here. When you're thinking about customer acquisition and retention, that represents about 60% of the total revenue that a sportsbook takes in as a cost center. So for every dollar of revenue that's brought in by a sportsbook, roughly 60 cents of that dollar goes right back out the door in terms of customer acquisition and customer retention spend. It's important to note that external partners can compete for much, but not necessarily all of that spend. So some of that spend around customer retention comes in the form of bonuses, promotions, etc. But a very significant chunk of that total spend is available for external marketing partners. To put some sort of loose frame around that opportunity, if we think about a nationwide sports betting market in the US of roughly $20 billion annually, we think that that implies a total marketing dollars opportunity of roughly $8 billion annually. So certainly material. It is important to note, however, that again, much as some of the marketing budget is internalized, there's also quite a bit of external competition for that $8 billion in annual revenue. So sports stakeholders are going to be competing against other media outlets. They're going to be competing against paid media such as Google, Facebook, so on and so forth. But the goal here is more to just emphasize, one, that sports betting marketing dollars make up a significant chunk of the economic opportunity for sports stakeholders, and two, that the size of that opportunity can be thought of in terms of billions of dollars as opposed to tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the other big bucket when we're talking about economic opportunities from legal sports betting for sports stakeholders is sports betting market access. So when I say market access, when states are authorizing sports betting, one of the key decisions that they're making is this question of who is going to be able to offer legal sports betting in the state. Increasingly, we are seeing states start to consider sports stakeholders, teams and stadia primarily, as stakeholders that qualify for market access, for the right to be able to operate a sports book, whether that be retail or online in a given state. It's also important to note that there is significant competition for market access broadly within the context of the US legal sports betting opportunity. To put it more simply, there are more sports books competing to participate in the majority of state markets than there are market access slots available in those states. Another important note when you're thinking about the market access opportunity is that you may have heard, oh, X got this much for market access in this state, Y got this much for market access in another state. These deals are highly variable when you're trying to figure out what the actual value of the deal is. And it really can vary by state, by partner. There is not necessarily the same sort of known quantity to the value of market access deals as there are to some other parts of the economic opportunity around legal sports betting. These deals, to put it another way, tend to be a lot more opaque. By contrast, when you're talking about customer acquisition or marketing deals, you'll see numbers thrown around that may vary, but they're relatively consistent. Sportsbook pays X amount for a new depositing customer. You don't have that same sort of clarity or certainty when you're talking about the value of a market access deal. So with that frame broadly set, I want to actually pull the camera back a little bit and talk about the policy levers that ultimately exercise the greatest impact on the economic opportunity from legal sports betting that sports stakeholders can realize. So these are some of the things that you really want to keep front of mind when you're watching legislation develop in your state, or when you're considering advocacy, getting involved in the crafting of legislation in a given state. So there are 5 levers that really impact the contour, the shape, and the nature of the economic opportunity from sports betting for stakeholders in the sports arena. The first is tax rate. The average tax rate that we're seeing rolled out on a state level basis is around 20%. That's a workable tax rate in terms of leaving sports books a good amount of room to be aggressive with marketing, promotions, to foster competitive, robust markets. As you start to see tax rates drift above 25%, a couple of things happen. And look, there's no magic number here, but that is the threshold where once you start to get above that, you really start to see the ability of sportsbooks to spend as aggressively on promotions and marketing. That starts to get constrained. And then the ability of legal sportsbooks to capture the maximum amount of demand from illegal and offshore sportsbooks also starts to get constrained, which then starts to bring in the potential of the legal market to a degree, and therefore decreases the economic opportunities for sports stakeholders. The license fee functions in a very similar way. Typically what you're seeing for license fees for sportsbook operators, right around the $500,000 mark, although there is significant variability. There are some states where the license fee is nominal, and then there are other states like Pennsylvania where the license fee is a low 8-figure hit. Much like tax rate, as the license fee continues to accelerate, sportsbooks are going to take that money from somewhere. And often where it comes from is marketing and promotional budgets, which then in turn does reduce the overall economic opportunity for sports stakeholders. Distribution channels, that's another key policy lever when you're thinking about what's the economic opportunity from legal sports betting. What we're talking about here is how will sports betting be made available to consumers? Will it be retail only? Will it be available online, or will it be available with both retail and online? And if it's available online, are there any restrictions, such as there have been in states such as Illinois, where you have to go into a physical location in order to create an online account? Obviously, the more a state embraces a broader distribution model with the fewest number of hurdles for consumer participation, the better for the market. On the whole, the larger the market potential is, and the greater the economic opportunity for sports stakeholders. The general trend, and there are definitely exceptions, but the general trend that we're seeing in the US right now is for states to embrace distribution models that include both retail and online. And in fact, in some states that started as retail only, or started with a retail plus a limited online model, we have seen an expansion into a fuller, more robust, unfettered online model over time. Competition is our fourth lever in terms of policy levers that really impact the economic opportunity. Simply put, the more operators there are in the market, the more competition that there is among those operators for consumers, the better it is for the market as a whole, and the better it is for sports stakeholders, especially if they hold some sort of strong relationship with consumers in that market. The trend here, again, has been toward more competitive markets, although there are very few markets that are truly open markets where all competitors can participate freely. Typically, we are seeing states place at least some sort of cap on the total number of sports books that can operate in a market. And our fifth and final lever is market access. States are all over the map on this question in terms of who is going to be given the right to operate a sports book. One trend that defined the first couple of waves of legal sports betting was to restrict this right to existing holders of retail gambling licenses, such as casinos and racetracks. But we are definitely seeing a more diverse and more multifaceted approach emerge as we move into the second and third waves of authorization. Let's jump into those two initial buckets and drill down a little further in terms of articulating the opportunity that comes from each for sports stakeholders, beginning with marketing partnerships. So it's the actual economic opportunity if you're a sports team in terms of what you can expect to flow through to your bottom line from marketing dollars via partnerships with sportsbooks. Obviously, this is a midpoint, and you're going to have quite a few folks cluster below this and a select number cluster above it. But ultimately, the economic opportunity here is likely in the high 7 to low 8 figures annually for a typical sports team. You're going to see that opportunity scale up as the attractiveness or the competitiveness of the market scales up, or as the reach of the team beyond its core market scales up. It's important to note that this back of the envelope, emphasis on back of the envelope, estimate does not include the economic opportunity from a team-owned RSN or other ancillary assets that the team may have access to. What are the licensing requirements that are necessary in order to participate in this opportunity? The good news is that licensing requirements to date for marketing partners in legal sports betting markets are relatively light. The one thing you should be aware of is that these requirements can become incredibly more burdensome if you enter into revenue sharing agreements with sportsbooks. That is a Rubicon for state gaming regulators. If you're a marketing partnership that's just taking a flat rate for sending a new player, that's one thing. But once you start to participate in the actual revenue generated by regulated sports betting, you do tip into a far more onerous tier of licensure. And then what are some of the typical deal mechanics? How do these marketing partnerships typically work between a sports team or stadium and a sportsbook operator? What we've seen so far is that they tend to be a blend of guaranteed payments and then some performance-based payments. And what sportsbooks are really focused on at this stage of the game is generating new depositing customers. That is the ultimate KPI at this point in the evolution of legal sports betting in the United States for a sportsbook partner. We are also starting to see deals speak more toward this idea of re-engagement or reactivation of customers and building in economic terms to account for those aspects of the deal. But at least as things stand today, you are going to maximize the amount of revenue that you can pull from these deals if you structure your approaches and your integrations around generating as many new depositing customers for your sportsbook partner as possible. Let's jump a little deeper into that second bucket of economic opportunity, market access. So I do want to provide the proper frame here, which is that sports team market access is definitely the exception rather than the rule when you're talking about legal sports betting in the US. To date, only a handful of states have decided to cut in sports stakeholders, whether teams or stadiums, in terms of giving them that primary license, that ability, that right to operate sports books or to sub-license that right to a sports betting partner. The most lucrative and relevant example of this is Arizona, where sports teams have license rights that are basically equivalent to retail gambling license holders. We've seen some other states, Illinois is an example, Maryland is an example, Virginia is another example, give some right or some economic advantage to sports stakeholders. But Arizona is definitely the standout in terms of the model that gives the most power and therefore the greatest economic opportunity to sports stakeholders. So if you're in a state that is yet to legalize, is yet to authorize sports betting, you really want to be looking to Arizona as your model when you're thinking about what do we want to be advocating for when this legislation is being written. So let's say that you are in a state where you're a sports stakeholder and you do control the right to market access. You do control the right to operate an online sports book in a given state market. And you're thinking about basically leasing out that right to a partner such as DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM, so on and so forth. What does that actually look like from an economic perspective? Again, remember, these opportunities are more variable and the terms surrounding them are far more opaque than a typical marketing partnership. This is also something that really varies dramatically depending on the size of the state, the attractiveness of the state, and just the basic rules of supply and demand. How many licenses, how many points of market access are available in the state against demand. So I'm going to walk through the economics of a market access deal in a mid-sized state with, let's say, relative scarcity of licenses, not hyper scarcity like you're seeing in New York, but not an oversupply like you're seeing in Iowa either. So what's that look like from an economic point of view? What are the deal terms you can expect as a baseline when you're thinking about what market access might be worth to you as a sports stakeholder? Typically, these deals include a few components. The first component is the upfront payment. And again, for a mid-sized state with relative scarcity of market access points, I would expect this upfront payment to be around $5 million. And remember, again, midpoints, estimates, meant to give you a sense of the scope, the scale, the contours of the opportunity. In addition to the upfront payment, there's typically an annual guarantee throughout the term of the market access agreement. And that annual guarantee is drawn against a revenue share, which is the third component of the agreement. I want to talk a little bit more about the revenue share because that's arguably the most complex part of these deals. We see these terms typically float somewhere between 5 to 10% of NGR. So let me talk for a second about what NGR is. It stands for net gaming revenue. There is no standard formula for defining NGR. It's a negotiation that you can undertake with your partner. Typically, NGR looks something like this. Gross gaming revenue, so the top line revenue that the sportsbook generates, less whatever state gaming tax is on that revenue, less some agreed to deduction for bonusing and promotional activities. So that's the gap between top line or GGR and then NGR, which is what you're going to be sharing revenue on with your market access partner. Why does this float so much? What would be a 5% deal versus a 10% deal? Here again is where things get complicated. Because since this is a revenue share deal, you as a market access holder are really trying to predict the future. You're really trying to think about how varying market access partners might generate more or less revenue. Because a lower share, obviously, of a partner that is winning your market is going to be worth quite a bit more than a higher share of a partner that ends up in the second or third tier in terms of the total market share that they hold. And so that's just one example of how these deals are trickier to negotiate and how they're a little harder to pin down from a value perspective than a typical marketing partnership where quite a bit more tends to be known up front. One of the interesting components, and I'll close the conversation on market access with this point, of negotiating a market access deal as a sports team owner or stadium owner versus a casino license holder or racetrack license holder is we see quite a bit of deals that bundle, and Arizona is a great example of this. I've seen a number of these deals in Arizona that bundle market access and an agreement, a commercial agreement on market access with a marketing partnership. By bringing those two pieces together and by negotiating them in tandem, we believe that there is a genuine opportunity for sports stakeholders to get a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, to really generate a value uplift by negotiating the market access and the marketing partnership commitment in tandem. That's where we're really seeing teams hit home runs, or whatever the preferred metaphor of your particular sport and your particular team is. It's in that combination of negotiating both market access and marketing partnerships in tandem. So hopefully that's provided you with a basic sense of how policy can impact the economic opportunity that sports betting represents to you as a stakeholder. It's not all about the marketing partnerships, although that's a big part of where the dollars come from. there's also increasingly this trend of market access, whether it's to retail or online, or retail and online, and the economic opportunity that represents for sports stakeholders. These are topics that we discuss regularly in greater depth in our syndicated research. We're happy to make a couple of complimentary copies of that syndicated research available to attendees. You should be able to find the links to that research available in the chat window, or feel free to reach out to the conference organizers if for whatever reason you're unable to access the materials in that way. With that, we'd certainly like to thank Sport Techie, our hosts, and appreciate your time and your energy and participation in our presentation.